Before you go any further with your build, you'll need to take each of your cooling fans and adjust the wire length to match that of the item that it will cool. You can see the specified wire lengths here. So for each fan, you'll take the original fan and you'll take the JST connector from the fan wire kit. Remember, the two fans for cooling the back case of the robot use a smaller JST connector, shown here. Measure the length that the wire needs to be, and if it's too long, you can trim from this side and you can trim from this side. If these combined are not long enough, you want to add some additional wire. So this is just 30 AWG silicone stranded wire. You have the heat shrink. So the first thing you want to do is just cut a small amount of heat shrink. So you've got a red and a black. And then before you join the wires, you'll just be sure to put a piece of heat shrink on each wire. Then trim your wires to where they need to be. Strip them so that they're about the same on each side. And then for each of the two conductors, you can take them, twist them together, and then you'll want to take a soldering iron and just solder this joint. Once it's soldered and connected well, take your heat shrink and cover the joint and then shrink it. And then you'll have a fan with a JST connector on the end that's the appropriate length for each of the fans that you need. Next, we're going to get bag 112, which contains the audio mount and the surface transducer mount. And for now, we're just going to take the audio mount. We'll leave the transducer mount in this bag for a few more steps. So I'm just going to take it and put it over here. I'll empty out the bag of hardware. So we've got 2 longer screws, 2 shorter screws. So we've got 2 6mm by M2 and then 2 10mm by M2 screws. Go ahead and with the 6mm screws, they're going to be used to hold the audio amp in place. But for these next few steps, I'm just going to put them in place so that they'll be there when we're ready to mount the audio amp. So I'm just going to screw them in most of the way into these inserts on this audio amp mount. These two, the taller inserts on this side. So we have those there. Now, these two, so we'll take our audio amp mount, and it fits right here on our front top piece, and it's held in place from the reverse side with the surface transducer. I'm not going to put the surface transducer in place yet. I'm going to use the screws to hold the audio amp mount in place on the front top part. So I'm just going to align these. You can see them here. And then I'll use these M2 10mm screws to fasten it. I'm going to fasten it most of the way, just so it'll hold this in place while we work. And you'll see that this extends past here because we don't have the audio, the surface transducer in place yet. So I'll put one in there, and then I'll align the other side and put the other one in. So that's just holding that in place for us. Set that here. We're going to need actuator number 2. So that is the front left leg actuator. We'll need bag number 110, which is the front left leg assembly. And we'll need bag 318, which is the front left leg fan. So I'm going to set the fan off to the side for a moment. Now, out of the front left leg assembly bag, we're only going to need a few things. So we'll need this motor mount, and we'll need this fan holder. We'll also need some of the small parts, some of the fastening screws. So let's go ahead and sort those out. Just going to pour them out here. And so these components we will use later when we attach the legs to the robot. So the screws that we need for those, I'm going to put back in this bag for now. So those are these very long 25mm M2 screws. So there's 4 of those. Just grab them and put them into this bag. And then that'll leave us with a collection of M2 by 8mm screws and M2 by 10mm screws. So there should be 4 of the 10mm screws. And we just want to separate those out. There's 4 of them. And those will be used later, so I'm going to put those 4 into this bag. And then I'll go ahead and just seal this bag back up for now. I'm going to put it back in bag 110. And then I'm going to set this bag to the side. Now, we should have remaining our M2 by 8mm screws. So we should have 8 of those. And then we should have 7 of our M2 nuts. So to start with, I'm going to set these aside. And what we're going to be doing is, this is the front left leg actuator. So if we look at our robot, and the robot's head is facing this direction, this actuator will be on the left, and it will go here, like this. So the way that this will attach is we will put this motor mount, which will connect to the actuator. That will mount to this plate, which will be secured through this fan holder. So for right now, I'm going to set the fan holder to the side, and I'm just going to work on attaching this motor mount to the actuator. So to do that, we're going to need 4 of these M2 nuts, and we'll need to put them into the corresponding slots. Let's go ahead and do that. Make sure they're aligned. So we've got those in place. And then I'll go ahead and just take this bracket, fit it here, align it to the holes in the actuator. You can see that. And then I'm going to take 4 of our M2 8mm screws to attach it to the actuator. So I'll just start on one side, and I'm just going to progressively add screws and progressively tighten, like we always do. So now that's attached to the motor, and you can see that it'll fit on right here. So we also have these other 4 M2 by 8mm screws, which are going to be used with the fan holder. So I'm going to set those over here with the fan holder. And then we've got 3 more of these M2 nuts. And once this motor is attached, like this, there's casing that goes around this way and over this way. And so we'll need these nuts to be in place for that casing to attach. So it's going to be 2 slots on top, so this one, and then 1 slot on the bottom of the actuator down here, this one. So let's go ahead and just put those M2 nuts into their slots so that they'll be ready when we get to that step later. Before we can attach the motor into position, there's some wiring that needs to go from this front electronics module past here and out to the back of the robot, as well as to the audio amp and to the actuator here. So it's best if we do that wiring before this motor is mounted. For this part, we will need bags 204, 206, 219, and then we're also going to need bag 305, which is the audio amplifier. So I'm going to set the audio amplifier up here for right now, and I'm going to start with bag 204, which is the actuator cable that goes between this actuator and the actuator that's mounted on this side. So go ahead and get that cable out. And it's going to connect to this port, the top port here, on the opposite side of this mount. So I'll go ahead and just connect that. And because we're going to be working with this actuator positioning it a lot, this is just going to be in our way for the time being. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take some painter's tape, and I'm going to take this cable and just bring it up like this, and I'm just going to put a piece of tape across here and around, just to hold this out of our way for right now. So next, I'm going to get the audio amplifier. So that board, and then cable 206, which is the audio system cable. And you'll see that it's got one end that has 2 connectors, one end that just has 1 connector. So I'm going to go ahead, and if you take the audio amp and flip it over, you'll see that these 2 fit into these 2 connectors. So there's one with 3 pins and one with 2 pins. So let's go ahead and just insert those. So there's the 3 pin, and here's the 2 pin, like that. And the audio amp will eventually mount in place here, like this. Now this cable plugs into this first port that's labeled audio. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. And so now we just have this dangling audio amp for the time being. Next, in bag 219, we have the front to back interconnect cable. And so this has a large connector on one end and then 3 smaller connectors on the other end. So the large connector goes towards the back of the robot, and these 3 connectors go to the front of the robot. So the 2 that we are concerned with are this first one, which has 3 conductors and is from the Raspberry Pi, and then this other one that has 3 conductors that's for the actuator. This one with 4 conductors goes to the power regulation module, so we'll just ignore it for right now. So these cables will need to come up through this area and then route one to the actuator and one to this front board. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in the one for the front board, which is the 3 cables coming from the back Raspberry Pi. And I'll plug it into the port that's labeled Pi, like that. And so now we have that connected, and we have these as well. Okay. So next we're going to go ahead and start to route these cables into place. And so I want essentially this actuator cable to go here. I want this Pi cable to go here. Then the amp will go here, and I want these to go around like that. And then this actuator will slide into place. It needs to plug in to this and slide in like that. So to orchestrate that a little bit better, what we're going to do first, so I'm going to go ahead and plug this actuator cable in to the bottom port here. And I want it to route out like this so that it squeezes between these 2 pieces of extruded plastic. To help us while we route all of these cables, I'm going to take a piece of elastic thread and tie it between these 2 holes to hold this wire in place. And you can use any kind of string or thread or small wire. I'm using this 0.75 millimeter diameter elastic thread, so it's got some stretch to it. And I'll use this in a lot of places in the robot to help secure wires. It's nice because it's soft, it doesn't damage the wires, and it's a little bit compliant. So, and we can use these 2 holes because they don't have anything that mounts to them. So I'm just going to go ahead and loop this elastic thread through one hole, and then I will loop it through the other hole. Actually, let me get this wire in here. And so I will take the elastic thread and I'm going to just bring it through one hole here, and then I'm going to bring it right back down through this hole. Under the wire. And so we're just creating a little barrier there. And all I'm going to do is just tie it down. So make sure I bring this cable roughly into position. And I'm just going to tie one knot and then a second knot. And so now I have a nice little loop there. And then I'm going to trim off the excess from my knot. Just use some clippers to do that. Okay. And so now I've just got this holding the wire in place. So next, I'm going to take a look at these 2 wires here that come out of the front electronics module, and I'm going to kind of get them aligned a little bit. So we want them to flow like that. We will need to plug things in here, so we'll need to be able to push this over a little bit. That's pretty good there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a little bit of elastic thread, and I'm just going to join them here. Just going to tie them together. And that just helps keep the wiring organized. So bring that in, put a knot in it. And then I'll double knot it. And then we'll go ahead and trim away the the excess here. Okay, so now I'm going to spin this around and take a look at how we want these wires to flow through. So we want these audio amp wires to come on this side of these two mounting holes. So we're going to go ahead and mount this audio amp. So I'm going to unscrew these screws that we had previously put in this area. I'm going to take the audio amp and just make sure that these wires are clearing this hole. And get that aligned. There we go. I'll put this 6mm screw in place. Hold the audio amp there. I'm going to tighten it almost all the way down, but not fully. With the other screw and align this side. Just loosen this just a little bit. So get that lined up. That screw in. And we'll tighten it most of the way, but not quite all of the way. Okay. And so now we want first to have the actuator cable pass between this little wall and the audio amp board here. And then next we want to have this pi cable pass along there. So what we're going to do is I'm going to bring the actuator up into position, and I'm going to kind of move these cables closer to where their destination will be. And I'm going to slide the actuator cable in between the audio amp and this little wall on the audio amp mount, like that. And then once that's in place, I'm going to bring this pi cable down, and I'm going to slide it in between the wall and the audio amp as well. There we go. And I want to make sure that they all go through this little cavity here, like that. And so I'll just work to get this motor, this actuator aligned, but also not crushing these wires. So I'm just going to use some tweezers just to lift these out of the way and get my alignment. Make sure that these are held in place. This is pretty good. Like that. Okay. And so you can see I've got this aligned here, these holes. So this will be pretty much the positioning that we want. So I'm going to rotate this way, and I'm just going to let that sit there. Now I'm going to get my fan holder and get my fan. And I'm going to take the cable from the fan, and I'm going to run it through the inside and out this hole, like that. And I want the fan to blow the air out through the fan grill. And so that means that the label will be facing up, the arrow will be pointing up. And the way that I like to put this in place is to bring the fan like this so that this cable will cross over it. So I'll just slide it into place, like that, and then pull this cable down so that it's passing across the fan and coming out like that. So that's set. Now we will attach this with these 4 M2 8mm screws. So I'm going to pick up this assembly and scoot my actuator back into place, make sure it's still aligned. It is. Flip that over, and we can see our alignment here. So I'll go ahead and get my fan holder, put that into the molded spot that it goes in. Get my alignment right, make sure I can see through these holes. And then I'll start with one M2 8mm screw. And I'm not going to tighten it all the way, but I'm going to tighten it most of the way. That in place. And I'll flip around to this side. Just going to move this fan cable wire out of the way. Make sure we've got our alignment. I'll put a screw in there. Tighten that down most of the way. I'm going to flip this back over and let's just take a look and make sure that everything is okay with our cables and the way that they're routed. This looks pretty good. This will fold back over in just a moment. All right, that's all looking pretty nice, and we'll tighten this audio amp down. So let's go ahead and add the other two screws. Sure, actuator is mounted in place. Make sure that these little M2 nuts stay in place. Remember, this one was here. Sometimes they're a little loose and they can fly around. So we've got those three still in place. Okay, so now we've attached this actuator